Did you know all Scotch whisky was originally made from malted barley? Commercial distillers began introducing whisky made from wheat, corn and rye in the late 18th century.
In 2009, the Scotch Whisky Regulations formally defined 5 categories of Scotch whisky. The relevant category description must appear clearly and prominently on every bottle of Scotch whisky sold. They are single malt Scotch, single grain Scotch, blended Scotch, blended malt Scotch, and blended grain Scotch.
Single malt Scotch whisky is often referred to as the Rolls-Royce of whisky. Single malt is a Scotch whisky distilled at a single distillery from water and malted barley, without the addition of any other cereals and by batch distillation in pot stills. From the 23rd of November 2012, single malt Scotch whisky must be bottled in Scotland.
Single grain Scotch whisky is a Scotch whisky distilled at a single distillery from water and malted barley with or without whole grains of other cereals, and which does not comply with the definition of single malt Scotch whisky.
Blended Scotch whisky can be a blend of one or more single malt whiskies with one or more single grain whiskies.
Blended malt Scotch whisky is actually, as the name suggests, a blend of single malt whiskies which have been distilled at more than one distillery.
Whereas blended grain Scotch whisky means a blend of single grain whiskies which have been distilled at more than one distillery.
The same regulations of 2009 went further to protect the traditional regional names associated with Scotch whisky production. These are Highland, Lowland, Speyside, Islands, Campbelltown, and Islay.
These names can only appear on whiskies distilled in those regions. And of course, if a whiskey label has a named distillery, all the whiskey has to come from that distillery.
In Australia, we follow almost all the same rules as Scotch whisky, with the main difference in the standards of labelling and production being Australian whisky can be aged for a minimum of 2 years, as opposed to 3 in Scotland.
Wow, we've gone through a lot already. Now that we have that out of the way, time for a wee dram.